As I promised in my past video about the Federal Reserve decision, here's a quick take about the US deficit, the US debt, and what politicians should do about it. This video is more broad, it doesn't focus too much on the numbers of the US government, but it is to start instilling an idea into the watcher. But before we start, here's a quick definition. The debt ceiling is a legal limit set by the United States government on the amount of money it can borrow. It is a way for the government to control its spending and avoid racking up too much debt. Sounds amazing, hasn't been really successful as a, let's say, policy. Every year, the United States government spends more money than it takes in through the tax revenue and any other revenues out there. To make up the difference, it borrows money through what we call treasury bond. It is the government's way to get a loan. As a normal US person goes out and gets a mortgage to buy a house, the government issues these treasury bonds to get money that they can spend on their plans, political reforms, and agendas. The debt ceiling puts a limit to how much money the government can raise through these treasury yields. And when it reaches that limit, which by the way happened 78 times in the history of the United States, so quite a lot, the government must take action to raise that limit or face financial crisis. Now you might be asking yourself, what do I have to do with this? I'm not the government, that is their money, I have my money, I have nothing to do with this. While the thought in theory is correct, when it comes to who bears the financial consequences if the government fails, well, that's a whole different story. One of the reasons why the government has to, let's say, raise its debt ceiling is to avoid a crisis. If the government was unable to pay off the debt, it would have to default on its debt, kind of like what happens on a home buyer when they fail to pay their mortgage. Their house is foreclosed on, they go bankrupt. Failing to pay off the debt from a government, on the other hand, will affect the entire financial ecosystem. It will devalue the US dollar because the US dollar, represented by the government, would lose credibility. It would lead to increased interest rates, and it would then lead to a severe recession. And who are the people who are mostly affected by a recession? Employees being laid off, families not being able to buy food for the kids and for themselves, companies not being able to make money, so having to fire more and more. And statistically speaking, if you're watching this video, you're very likely to be one of these categories. But without getting into the crisis mode, there are other reasons why the government has to raise this debt ceiling. One of them is to sustain the ecosystem you're living in right now. A high level of public debt can affect the investment by the government into things like education, infrastructure, or research and development. You take public education, the paved roads you drive on, the electric grid, some of the, let's say, internet grids out there for granted, but they're mostly sustained by this government debt. But let's go now a little bit more on the political side. It is heartwarming to see politicians talk about social and political issues, bringing out reforms, proposals, new budgets to push out agendas, pushed on by the concept of leaving a better place for future generations, which, as beautifully sounding as they are, tend to undermine the destructive economical consequences the same could have on the future generations they would like to save and help. Reforms and incentives, take for example the Green New Deal, which by the way has some really beautiful arguments, take money. And as we just described, they take money from a system that is already in deficit, that is already in a vicious cycle, making it harder and harder to revert the trend. If we subdivide the entire US debt across the entire US population, every single American citizen would owe around $250,000. If you thought that your student loan, car payment, mortgage, credit card bills were a lot, add another $250,000 of debt on your shoulders. Why am I saying this? Well, without even you noticing too much, the government debt is already affecting your daily life. If you're watching this video, you're probably an adult, you're probably an employee with a W-2 contract. You might not see it this way, but the taxes you pay every single year are your way to pay off the government mortgage. In 2022, you also experienced another kind of tax, which normally is more subtle, but last year was much stronger, which is inflation. Increased gas prices, food, and housing. And let me explain a little bit better. There are three ways for a government to pay off its debt: taxation, printing money, and budget cuts. Taking back from my past argument, last year, you experience the consequences of printing money. The second factor. During the pandemic, the government printed enormous amount of money to save the United States. We saw handouts, we saw business incentives, printing and printing of money. It has been said that during the pandemic, 40% of the supply of the US dollar has been printed. 40% of the entire supply, historical supply of the United States dollar has been printed. That is a lot of money. It all seemed very cool for everybody until we saw the lagging effect of this large influx of money. Gas prices doubled, car prices went over the roof. Housing prices, let's not even talk about it. Egg prices raised 500%, also for other reasons, but 500% in the past year. And who bear the burden? We did. Taxes. This was the first factor here. Most of us don't feel them. If you're employed through a W-2 contract, the taxes are withheld mostly from your paycheck every single week or every 2 weeks. Politicians and people keep on pushing the agenda of taxing the rich and the corporations. Yet in times of crisis, this solution is very hard to achieve. Although taxing billionaires and companies sounds amazing, it is a very complex task. Companies and billionaires can move money abroad, they can use tax loopholes, or even worse, they can leave the country completely, leaving more people jobless. Normal W-2 employees, on the other hand, having the most traceable income from an IRS perspective. Yes, your income is the most traceable if you are a W-2 employee, because companies have to comply with the IRS when they hire people. The same W-2 employees are the easiest to exploit when it comes to increasing taxes, because the government knows how much you're making and knows exactly how much they can take from you. The last one, namely cutting budgets, seems to be the, let's say, least painful of the solutions, although it can still affect specific areas. If you're cutting budget in specific areas, you're creating some deficiencies. So there will be some pain, but it won't be across the entire United States, let's say on a global level. No matter what, any action taken out by the US government to improve the deficit will create some pain, but it will reward us in the long term, as it will put us in a positive trajectory, especially if compared with the rest of the world that is stacking up more and more debt. If you go through personal finance videos and articles, the concept of delayed gratification seems to be the main principle to achieve financial independence. Sacrifice today your gratification, save and invest and pay your debt so you can reap the benefits of financial freedom in the future. Even if a government is a much more complex ecosystem than an individual, I believe that the same concept really holds true here, where the lavish spending and present gratification can be represented by new reforms, new investments, and new things. And the sacrifice can be represented by focusing on paying off the debt today to put our future generations in a better future. And the earlier we address this, the less drastic the measures to pay off debt will be. The bigger the debt, the less likely we will be to pay it off. And the more drastic the measures have to be for us to pay it off. Why am I talking about this? As an Italian, I come from a country where we already reached the point of no return. We're in a situation where my generation of workers is paying for the pensions of our parents. And I believe that we are on a trajectory that by the time I will retire, my nephews, not even my kids, my nephews will be paying for my pension. That's how bad it's getting. So we're putting a bigger and bigger financial burden on the same generations that we're trying to save through reforms that are more and more expensive for our Italian government. In conclusion, I agree. There are a lot of political and social issues in America that needs to be addressed. However, it is important to start thinking about cutting the deficit, reducing debt, and getting to a better financial position. All this by taking steps to increase government revenue, decrease government spending, and decrease also inflation, which is something we're working on right now. In the 1970s, the Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker brought interest rates to the highest level in the United States history to fight one of the highest inflation that the US ever experienced. At the time, the measure was criticized. People hated him. Fast forward to today, we remember that time and that person as the person that saved the United States from hyperinflation. Drastic measures taken today to save the economy and to save the United States, current and future generations, will not be happily taken in by the United States and by the citizens. However, will be seen as very positive by our future generations. And we need to plant the trees, I believe, to save our future. It comes also with reforms But as this issue is becoming bigger and bigger, it is better to address it now than in the future. I hope this helps. Let me know what you think. Thank you for watching. Ciao.